The Arsenal That Won the War. December 8, 1941. Willow Run, Michigan. Charles Sorensen stood in an empty field outside Detroit, watching snow fall on frozen farmland. He was Henry Ford's right-hand man, the genius behind the assembly line that had revolutionized automobile production. Now, at age 60, he faced an impossible task. The government wanted him to build bombers. Not just a few bombers, but one enormous B-24 Liberator every single hour. Sorensen looked at that empty field and thought they were insane. He had reason to doubt. A B-24 Liberator contained 1.2 million parts. Each aircraft required 450,000 rivets. The wings alone spanned 110 feet. Traditional aircraft plants took months to build a single bomber, with skilled craftsmen hand-fitting each component. And now they wanted factory workers, farmhands, and housewives to mass-produce them like Model T Fords? Sorensen wrote in his diary that night, "The generals don't understand manufacturing. This isn't making cars. This is making flying fortresses. I don't see how it can work." Across the Atlantic, German industrial planners were equally skeptical, but for different reasons. Reichsminister Albert Speer reviewed intelligence reports about American production targets with something approaching contempt. In his Berlin office that winter, he told his staff that American claims were obvious propaganda. The Americans talk of building 60,000 aircraft in a single year, he said. This is fantasy. Impossible numbers meant to frighten us. Germany, after all, had Europe's most advanced industrial base, the Krupp Steel Works, the Daimler-Benz factories, the Messerschmitt plants. They had conquered territories stretching from France to the outskirts of Moscow, giving them access to resources, factories, and labor across an entire continent. But something was about to happen that would reshape the entire war. Something that began not with generals or politicians, but with ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things. Let me take you to Marinship in Sausalito, California. It's April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor. A woman named Rosina Tucker walks through the gates on her first day of work. She's 47 years old, an African-American woman who had spent her life as a domestic worker. She's never held a welding torch. She's never worked in a factory. The foreman hands her protective gear and points to a massive ship hall. Within 6 weeks, Rosina Tucker would be leading a welding crew. Within 6 months, she would help launch a Liberty ship in just 15 days from keel laying to christening. 15 days. Think about that number. Before the war, building a cargo ship took nearly a year. The British took 230 days on average. Now, here was Rosina Tucker, who had been cleaning houses in January, helping construct a 441-foot cargo vessel in 2 weeks. And she wasn't alone. Marinship employed 20,000 workers at its peak. Across America, shipyards that didn't exist in 1940 were launching ships faster than the Germans could sink them. The numbers tell a story that still seems impossible. In 1941, American shipyards produced 1.1 million tons of shipping. In 1942, they produced 8 million tons. In 1943, 19 million tons. To put that in perspective, the entire British merchant fleet in 1939 totaled 17.8 million tons accumulated over centuries of maritime tradition. America was now building more than that every single year. But let me take you back to that frozen field in Michigan, because what happened at Willow Run reveals something crucial about how America won this war. Charles Sorensen didn't give up. Instead, he did something radical. He visited the Consolidated Aircraft plant in San Diego, where B-24s were being built the traditional way. He watched skilled craftsmen building aircraft as if they were custom automobiles. Then he returned to Michigan and started from scratch. He designed the largest room under one roof in the world. The Willow Run plant stretched 3,200 feet long and 1,280 feet wide. That's over half a mile of factory floor. He created an assembly line where the bombers moved and the workers stayed in place. He broke down every complex task into simple, repeatable steps that someone could learn in days, not years. On April 10, 1942, construction began. By September, the first B-24 rolled off the line. But Sorensen's diary from those early months reveals constant struggle. October 3, 1942, produced 5 bombers this month. We need to make 450. I lie awake wondering if I've promised the impossible. December 15, 1942, 12 aircraft this month. Better, but not enough. The boys are dying in Europe. We need to do better. Then something shifted. It started with the workers themselves. A woman named May Creer moved from North Dakota to work at Willow Run. She was 19 years old. She'd never seen a factory before. In an interview decades later, she remembered her first day. They handed me a rivet gun and said, "Here's how you load it, here's how you pull the trigger, and here's the pattern you need to follow." I was terrified. But within a week, I could do it without thinking. Within a month, I was teaching others. We got faster and faster. It became almost like a dance. By March 1943, Willow Run was producing 75 bombers per month. By August 1943, 150 per month. And in March 1944, they finally hit Sorensen's impossible goal: 1 B-24 in 63 minutes. The plant operated 24 hours a day. Workers came in 3 shifts. At peak production, 42,000 people worked at Willow Run. Most had never built anything more complex than a fence. Together, they produced 8,685 B-24 Liberators. Now multiply that story across American industry. The Ford Motor Company, which made cars, started making B-24 bombers. General Motors, which made Chevrolets and Buicks, retooled to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery shells. A jukebox manufacturer named Wurlitzer began making compasses and military equipment. A pinball machine company called Lionel switched to making naval instruments. The Mattituck Manufacturing Company, which made upholstery nails, started producing .50 caliber ammunition. A lipstick tube factory converted to making cartridge cases. I want you to meet Lieutenant Paul Bennett. He was a tank commander with the 3rd Armored Division in June 1944. His 75mm tank was hit by a German Panther near Caen in France. The German Panther was superior in almost every way. Its 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from 1,500 yards. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor even at close range. Paul's tank was knocked out. His driver was killed. Paul himself was wounded. He wrote a bitter letter to his brother back in Cleveland. They keep sending us out in these steel coffins against German tanks that can kill us before we even see them. It's not courage they need from us, it's miracles. But here's what Paul didn't know in June 1944. Here's what changed the entire equation. For every Panther tank Germany produced, America made 5 Shermans. For every Tiger tank, America made 10 Shermans. It wasn't about having the best tank, it was about having enough tanks. By the end of the war, Germany had produced about 6,000 Panther and Tiger tanks combined. America produced 49,234 Sherman tanks. When Paul's tank was destroyed, another Sherman was on a ship heading to France. When that one was destroyed, 2 more were waiting. The Germans understood quality. They built tanks like Swiss watches, with precision engineering and superior firepower. But that precision required time, skilled labor, and resources they didn't have. A single Tiger tank took 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman took 10,000 man-hours. The Germans were making masterpieces. Americans were making enough. Let me show you what this meant in human terms. Klaus Schmidt was a German tank commander on the Eastern Front. His diary, captured after the war, reveals his growing despair. May 15, 1943. We destroyed 3 Soviet T-34s today without loss. Our Panther is invincible. June 20, 1943. Destroyed 4 more enemy tanks. But I see more enemy tanks every day. Where are they all coming from? July 30th, 1943. We knocked out 8 enemy tanks today, but we lost 2 of our Panthers, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdown. We have no spare parts. The tanks we destroy are replaced overnight. Our tanks, once lost, are gone forever. August 14th, 1943. I begin to understand. They don't need better tanks. They just need more tanks than we have ammunition. This was the heart of American industrial strategy, overwhelming material superiority, and it extended to every aspect of the war. Aircraft production tells the same story. In 1939, Germany produced 8,295 aircraft. The United States produced 5,856. Germany was ahead. But look what happened in 1941. Germany produced 12,401 aircraft. The United States produced 26,277. In 1942, Germany produced 15,409 aircraft. The United States produced 47,836. In 1943, Germany produced 24,807 aircraft. The United States produced 85,898. In 1944, at the peak of their production, Germany manufactured 39,807 aircraft. The United States produced 96,318. Let's pause on those 1944 numbers. Germany, with all of Europe's resources, using slave labor, pushing their industry to the absolute limit, managed to build 39,807 aircraft. America, while also building ships, tanks, trucks, and supplying its allies, built 96,318 aircraft. That's not twice as many. That's not even close to twice as many. That's nearly 2.5 times as many. Germany was drowning in American aircraft. A Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler wrote about this in letters to his mother. December 1943. Today I shot down an American bomber. It was my 22nd victory. But when I returned to base, there were 50 new American bombers over Germany. January 1944. We shoot them down, but more always come. We are winning every battle but losing the war. March 1944. I am exhausted. We fly 4-5 missions a day. Every mission, I see the sky filled with American aircraft. Where are they all coming from? Where were they coming from? They were coming from places like Willow Run. They were coming from Boeing's Seattle plant, where workers produced 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses every single day. They were coming from Consolidated's Fort Worth plant. They were coming from Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, where they built 10,000 aircraft during the war. They were coming from North American Aviation, which produced 41,000 aircraft at multiple facilities. But America wasn't just building quantity. Let me tell you about Benjamin Davis Jr. He was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American military pilots in the United States Armed Forces. In January 1944, his unit transitioned from older P-40 Warhawks to the new P-51 Mustang. Benjamin wrote to his father, who himself was an Army general. The P-51 is extraordinary. It's as fast as anything the Germans have. It can fly farther than any fighter we've ever had. And Dad, we're getting them by the hundreds. The P-51 Mustang represents something crucial about American production. It wasn't just mass production. It was mass production of increasingly sophisticated technology. The P-51 could fly 1,650 miles on internal fuel. With drop tanks, it could fly 2,080 miles. This meant American fighters could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Before the P-51, German fighters would wait until American bombers ran out of fighter escort, then attack. After the P-51, there was nowhere the bombers went without fighter protection. And America built 15,000 of them. 15,000 long-range fighters with performance equal or superior to anything the Germans flew. The plant in Inglewood, California, produced one P-51 every 90 minutes at peak production. The Germans couldn't match this. They had excellent engineers who designed outstanding aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter.
but they couldn't produce them in sufficient numbers. The Messerschmitt 262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything the Allies had. Germany built 1,430 of them. But by the time they entered service, they were facing 15,000 Mustangs, thousands of Thunderbolts, thousands of British Spitfires. The Messerschmitt 262 pilots might win individual dogfights, but they couldn't change the outcome. Let me take you inside a German factory. Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist, described visiting the Messerschmitt plants in 1944. What I saw horrified me. Workers, many of them slave laborers from concentration camps, half-starved, trying to assemble precision aircraft. Allied bombing had destroyed machine tools. There were shortages of aluminum, shortages of rubber, shortages of fuel. And the workers, they had no spirit. How could they? They were slaves building weapons for their captors. The Americans had workers who believed in what they were building. That made all the difference. This is important. American workers weren't slaves or conscripts. They were volunteers, many of them women, and minorities who had been excluded from industrial work before the war. They were paid decent wages. They worked hard because they wanted to, because they believed it mattered. Let me introduce you to Maya Angelou. Yes, the famous poet and author. In 1943, she was 15 years old, living in San Francisco. She became the first African-American female streetcar conductor in San Francisco. But before that, she worked briefly in a machine shop supporting the war effort. Decades later, she wrote about that time. We young women believed we were part of something larger than ourselves. We were building the weapons that would free the world from tyranny. When I put together components for aircraft, I imagined each piece flying over Germany, bringing the war to an end. I was 15 years old, and I felt like I mattered. This psychological factor, this sense of purpose, was something the Axis powers couldn't replicate. German workers in 1944 were bombed nightly, short on food, and increasingly certain they were going to lose. Japanese workers faced similar conditions. American workers were safe, well-fed, well-paid, and confident of victory. Productivity isn't just about machines and materials, it's about morale. Now, let me show you the logistics that made all this production meaningful. Building weapons is only half the challenge. You have to get them to the battlefield. Andrew Higgins ran a boat company in New Orleans. Before the war, he built shallow draft boats for oil exploration in Louisiana swamps. The Navy asked him to design a landing craft that could carry troops right onto a beach. Higgins created what became known as the Higgins Boat, officially the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. It was a simple design, a flat-bottomed boat with a ramp at the front that dropped down to let soldiers run directly onto the beach. Eisenhower later said that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. That might sound like hyperbole until you understand the numbers. Higgins Industries produced 20,904 landing craft. Without them, the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific was impossible. Without them, D-Day was impossible. The invasions of Sicily, Italy, southern France, Normandy, all depended on Higgins boats getting troops from ships to shore. But here's what's remarkable. In 1940, Higgins Industries employed 75 people making civilian boats. By 1943, the company employed 30,000 people and was producing 700 boats per month. A boat company from Louisiana became more important to the war effort than many armored divisions. And transport ships. Remember those Liberty ships I mentioned earlier? Let me give you the full picture. From 1941 to 1945, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships. Each one could carry 9,140 tons of cargo. They also built 531 larger Victory ships. They built 417 tankers. They built 1,162 naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. They built those 20,000 landing craft. All this in less than 4 years. Japan, starting the war with one of the world's most powerful navies, couldn't keep pace. In 1941, Japan had 6.1 million tons of merchant shipping. They needed 3 million tons per year just to sustain their economy and supply their military. American submarines alone sank 5.3 million tons of Japanese shipping during the war. Japanese shipyards could build only 4.1 million tons of replacement shipping during the entire war. By 1945, Japan was starving, unable to move oil from the East Indies, unable to move supplies to their island garrisons. They had been strangled by American industrial might. A Japanese logistics officer named Tamaichi Hara survived the war and wrote a memoir. In it, he described the moment he realized Japan couldn't win. It was in 1943, after the Guadalcanal campaign. He wrote, "I looked at the reports. We had lost transport capacity we couldn't replace. The Americans were sinking our ships faster than we could build them. But more importantly, they were building their ships faster than we could sink them. The mathematics were simple and terrible. We couldn't win a long war. And the Americans were going to make it a long war."
That word, mathematics, appears over and over in diaries and memoirs from Axis commanders. They kept running into arithmetic they couldn't solve. German General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, wrote in his memoirs about the Eastern Front, "I calculated what we would need to defeat the Soviet Union. We needed 3,000 tanks to maintain offensive operations, accounting for losses. We were producing perhaps 600 tanks per month at best. The Soviets were losing tanks at an incredible rate, but they kept bringing up more. I asked our intelligence officers where all these Soviet tanks were coming from. They showed me reports about American Lend-Lease. The Americans were sending thousands of trucks, hundreds of locomotives, entire factories to the Soviets. We were fighting not just the Soviet Union, but American industry operating on Soviet soil. This is crucial. American production didn't just supply American forces. Through Lend-Lease, America became the arsenal for all the Allied powers. To Britain, the United States sent 31,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, 1,900 locomotives, 11,000 railway cars, and 2.6 million tons of steel. To the Soviet Union, the United States sent 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, 51,000 jeeps, 375,000 trucks, 1.9 million miles of telephone wire, 15 million pairs of boots, and 4.5 million tons of food. To China, Australia, France, and other allies, billions more in equipment and supplies. Stalin himself admitted this. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Roosevelt asked Stalin to toast American production. Stalin stood and said, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done to win this war. The most important things in this war are machines. The United States has proven it can turn out 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can turn out, at most, 3,000 airplanes a month. England turns out 3,000 to 3,500. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost this war." Coming from Stalin, who rarely praised anyone, this admission reveals everything. Let me take you to a specific moment that captures all of this. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Normandy invasion. Private Robert Sales from Philadelphia was in the first wave hitting Omaha Beach. He was 19 years old. He rowed in a Higgins boat toward shore. Around him, he could see 5,000 ships and landing craft. Overhead, 11,000 aircraft. He wrote a letter to his mother 3 days later. "Mom, I will never forget that morning. The ocean was covered with ships as far as I could see. The sky was full of our planes. I had never seen so many machines, so much equipment. I felt like I was a tiny part of something impossibly huge. The Germans fought hard, but how could they win? We had everything." Everything. That word appears in so many letters and memoirs from American servicemen. They describe feeling overwhelmed by the scale of American supply. Not just weapons, but everything. By 1944, American factories were producing 2 million trucks per year.
Compare that to Germany's entire production of 346,000 trucks during the whole war. American forces were mechanized to a degree no army in history had ever achieved. Every American division had 2,000 vehicles. German divisions relied heavily on horses. In 1944, the Wehrmacht was using 1.2 million horses for transport on the Eastern Front. They were using horses while fighting an enemy that moved on wheels and tracks. An American soldier named Charles MacDonald wrote about this. He described capturing a German position in Belgium in late 1944. "We overran their supply depot. I expected to find sophisticated equipment, secret weapons, wonder materials. Instead, I found wooden crates of ammunition, horse-drawn wagons, soldiers wearing coats made from blankets. They were running out of everything. Meanwhile, we had so much equipment we didn't know what to do with it all. We had chocolate bars and cigarettes. We had new uniforms. We had gasoline trucks everywhere." The contrast was shocking. Food is part of this story too. American soldiers ate 4,000 calories per day on average. They had meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, and desserts. German soldiers in 1944 were on reduced rations. Japanese soldiers on isolated island garrisons were starving. Soviet soldiers, despite Lend-Lease, still faced chronic food shortages. But Americans? Americans complained that the food was boring, not that there wasn't enough. This wasn't about luxury, it was about fighting capability. Well-fed soldiers fight better, march farther, resist disease, and maintain morale. Logistics wins wars. And speaking of logistics, let me tell you about the Red Ball Express. After the breakout from Normandy in August 1944, Allied armies raced across France faster than anyone anticipated. They outran their supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be trucked from Normandy beaches to frontline units hundreds of miles away. The Red Ball Express was the truck convoy system that made this possible. At its peak, 6,000 trucks operated day and night, driven by soldiers, many of them African American, who made this supply run possible. They moved 12,500 tons of supplies per day over roads that weren't designed for this volume of traffic. From August 25th to November 16th, 1944, they delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. Sergeant Bill Thomas drove for the Red Ball Express. Years later, he described it. "We drove 20 hours a day. We'd sleep for 4 hours, then back on the road. The trucks were American, the fuel was American, the cargo was American. Every shell, every gallon of gas, every can of food at the front line came through us. The Germans couldn't do this. They didn't have the trucks. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't have the roads. They sure as hell didn't have 412,000 tons of supplies to move. We were burying them in material." Now, I want to address something important. Some people look at these numbers and think American victory was inevitable once the United States entered the war. That's not true. Industrial capacity had to be unlocked, organized, and directed with incredible efficiency. In early 1942, American production was still ramping up. Factories were converting from civilian to military production. Workers were learning new skills. The logistics networks didn't exist yet. If Germany had won the Battle of Britain, if Japan had destroyed the American carrier fleet at Midway, if the Soviets had collapsed in 1942, the war might have ended before American production reached its peak. Victory wasn't inevitable. It was achieved through millions of individual decisions, innovations, and sacrifices. Let me tell you about John Gorsuch. He was a production engineer at Republic Steel in Ohio. In 1942, the military needed a new type of armor steel that was harder and lighter than previous versions. Traditional metallurgy said it couldn't be done, that you couldn't make steel both harder and lighter. John spent 8 months experimenting with alloy compositions and heat treatments. He wrote in his technical notes, "Every failure brings me closer to understanding what might work." In June 1943, he succeeded. His new steel composition was adopted for Sherman tank armor. It saved lives. How many lives? Impossible to know. But John Gorsuch, a metallurgist most people never heard of, changed the war. Multiply that story by thousands. Engineers solving problems, factory workers improving techniques, managers finding efficiencies. All of it mattered. William Knudsen was the man Roosevelt put in charge of coordinating American war production. He had been president of General Motors. Now he worked for $1 a year. $1 a year man, they called him, coordinating between government and industry. In 1940, he wrote a memo that outlined his philosophy. We can't plan this like the Germans plan. We don't have a command economy where the government dictates everything. We have to work with private industry, convince them, incentivize them, coordinate them. It's messier than a planned economy, but if we can make it work, it will be more flexible, more innovative, and more productive than anything the Axis can create.
He was right. American production was chaotic in some ways. Different companies competed for contracts. The Army and Navy sometimes wanted different specifications for the same equipment. There were shortages and bottlenecks and confusion. But that chaos created innovation. Companies had incentives to find better, faster, cheaper ways to build things. Workers who suggested improvements got bonuses. The system rewarded success. Compare that to Germany. Albert Speer centralized everything. On paper, it was efficient. In reality, it was brittle. When Allied bombing destroyed one factory, everything depending on that factory stopped. American production was distributed across the continent. Bombing one plant barely registered in overall output. Let me take you to a very specific moment that illustrates this. August 17, 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. American bombers attacked German ball bearing factories. Ball bearings were critical for everything, from aircraft to tanks to trucks. The Americans believed that destroying Germany's ball bearing production would cripple the whole war machine. They were wrong. German production did drop temporarily, but the Germans dispersed production to dozens of smaller plants, imported ball bearings from Switzerland and Sweden, and within months had recovered. More importantly, that raid cost the Americans 60 bombers and 600 aircrew. The raid failed not because the bombing was ineffective, but because concentrated production meant the damage could be worked around. Now imagine if the Germans had bombed American ball bearing production. Where would they bomb? There were dozens of plants across the United States. Destroying one or two would have been meaningless. The others would have ramped up production. American industry had redundancy built in, not through planning, but through the natural diversity of a continental economy. I want to talk about one more number that captures everything: steel production. Steel is the foundation of industrial warfare. You need steel for ships, tanks, aircraft, trucks, artillery, bullets, literally everything. In 1939, the United States produced 52.8 million tons of steel. Germany produced 23.7 million tons. Already a significant advantage for America. But watch what happened during the war. In 1943, the United States produced 80.6 million tons of steel. Germany produced 34.6 million tons. The United States alone was producing more than twice as much steel as Germany. But it gets better. Britain produced 13.2 million tons. The Soviet Union produced 8.5 million tons. So the Allies together produced 102.3 million tons of steel in 1943. Germany, even with all of conquered Europe's resources, produced 34.6 million tons. The Axis powers were being buried in steel. Japan produced 7.8 million tons of steel in 1943. All the Axis powers combined produced maybe 45 million tons of steel. America alone produced 80.6 million tons. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. A German officer named Kurt von Hammerstein put it simply in a letter to his wife in 1944. We are fighting the entire world's industrial capacity. We never had a chance. We only had the element of surprise and our skill at arms. Once the war became about production, we were doomed. The Germans could lose 10 tanks for every one of ours and still win. They could lose 2 aircraft for every one of ours and still win. They had so much that they could afford to waste it. We had so little, we couldn't afford to lose anything. Now let me bring this to the human level one more time, because these numbers, as staggering as they are, represent human lives saved and lost. Frank Buckles was the last surviving American veteran of World War I. He lived until 2011. Before he died, he gave an interview about what he learned from 2 world wars. He said, "In the First War, we weren't ready. We didn't have the equipment, didn't have the training, didn't have the supplies. American soldiers in 1917 fought with French and British equipment because we hadn't built our own. In the Second War, we were ready. Our boys had the best equipment in the world and enough of it. That's the difference between winning and losing. That's the difference between boys coming home and boys dying in muddy fields far from home." He was talking about his friends, real people who lived or died based on whether they had proper equipment. John Basilone was a Marine who fought at Guadalcanal. He single-handedly held off a Japanese assault, operating a machine gun for hours. He received the Medal of Honor. They brought him back to the United States to sell war bonds. He could have stayed stateside, safe, a hero. He insisted on going back to combat. He died on Iwo Jima in February 1945. In his last letter home, he wrote about American equipment. He said, "The Japs are tough, brave fighters, but we have advantages they don't. Every time I needed ammunition, there was ammunition. Every time I needed support, there were planes overhead. Every time we needed naval fire, the ships were there. The Japs fought hard, but they ran out of everything. We never did. That's not luck. That's America." He died a few days after writing that, but he was right. American industrial production didn't just win battles, it saved lives. American soldiers died. Of course they died. War is terrible. But they died in far smaller numbers than they would have without overwhelming material superiority. The Eastern Front showed what happened when industrial production lagged. Soviet soldiers in 1941 and 1942 often faced German tanks without anti-tank weapons. They charged German positions without adequate artillery support. The casualties were horrific. By 1944, with American Lend-Lease supplying trucks, locomotives, food, and raw materials, Soviet forces had the mobility and supply to conduct massive operations. Soviet casualties were still terrible, but they were lower than they had been earlier in the war. So yes, these numbers represent steel and aluminum and rubber, but they also represent fathers who came home to their children, brothers who survived, sons who lived to grow old. Let me take you to May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe was over. Charles Sorensen, the man who built Willow Run, was 64 years old now. He went back to that field outside Detroit where the factory still stood. In his diary he wrote, "I doubted this could work. I thought the government was asking for the impossible. But I learned something about America. When we commit to something, when we truly commit, we are unstoppable. Not because we're smarter or braver than others, but because we can organize, we can produce, we can build on a scale no one else can match. We turned farmers and homemakers into industrial workers. We turned an empty field into the largest factory in the world, and we won." 3 months later, August 15, 1945, VJ Day. The war in Japan ended, not just because of the atomic bombs, though they were the final blow. Japan had already lost. They had lost because American submarines had strangled their supply lines, because American bombers had burned their cities, because American factories had built more ships, more planes, more everything than Japan could ever hope to destroy. A Japanese admiral named Motomi Ugaki kept a diary throughout the war. His final entry, written just before he flew on a suicide mission after the surrender, contained a striking admission. He wrote, "We fought with courage, we fought with skill, but courage and skill are not enough when your enemy has 100 bullets for every one you have, when they have 100 aircraft for every one you have, when they replace every loss overnight and you cannot replace anything. This was not a war we could win. This was mathematics." Mathematics, arithmetic, numbers, the unglamorous reality of industrial warfare. But let me end with something more than numbers, because this story is ultimately about what America chose to do and why it mattered. In 1940, America was still recovering from the Depression. Unemployment was high, factories were idle. The country was divided about whether to enter another European war. Then came Pearl Harbor, and everything changed. What happened over the next 4 years was unprecedented. America didn't just win a war. America proved that democracy could compete with totalitarianism in total war. That free people, working voluntarily, could outproduce slave labor and command economies. That a nation dedicated to peace could become the most formidable military power on earth when necessary, then return to peace when the war ended. The factories that built bombers went back to building cars. The shipyards went back to building cargo vessels. Rosina Tucker went back to civilian life. May Creer went home to North Dakota. The soldiers came home. The arsenal of democracy had served its purpose. But the lesson remained. When America commits, when America focuses its industrial might and its people's determination on a goal, that goal becomes achievable. Not easily, not without sacrifice, but achievably. The Axis powers made a fundamental miscalculation. They believed democracies were weak, divided, incapable of sustained effort. They believed totalitarian efficiency would triumph over democratic chaos. They were wrong. Democratic chaos, it turned out, was actually flexibility and innovation. Free people, it turned out, worked harder than slaves. A country that had to persuade and motivate its citizens rather than command them turned out to be more powerful, not less. The numbers tell the story. 296,000 aircraft produced, 86,000 tanks, 2,700 Liberty ships, 80 million tons of steel per year. But behind every number was a person, a welder in Sausalito, a riveter in Michigan, a truck driver in France, a sailor in the Pacific, a pilot over Germany, people who believed what they were doing mattered. And they were right. It mattered more than perhaps any industrial effort in human history. It ended the Nazi regime. It saved millions from extermination. It preserved freedom. It created the foundation for the post-war world. The arsenal of democracy didn't just defeat the Axis, it prevented a dark age. I want to take you to one final moment. It's 1985. 40 years after the war ended. A ceremony is being held at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. They're unveiling a restored B-24 Liberator, the same type that Charles Sorensen mass-produced at Willow Run. In the audience sits an elderly woman named Dorothy Cole. She's 73 years old. During the war, she worked at Willow Run, installing electrical systems in those bombers. She brought with her a photograph. It shows her at age 33, wearing coveralls, holding a rivet gun, standing in front of a B-24. She's smiling. A reporter asks her what she remembers most about those years. She thinks for a moment, then says, "I remember being tired all the time. I remember my hands hurting from the work, but I also remember feeling proud. My husband was overseas fighting. I couldn't fight with a rifle, but I could build the airplane that would protect him. Every bomber we finished, I thought, this one might save lives. This one might help end the war sooner. I wasn't just building a machine. I was helping to win."
She pauses, looking at the restored bomber. Then she adds, "You know what surprised me most? After the war, people forgot how much we built, how hard we worked. They remembered the soldiers, and they should. But they forgot that behind every soldier was a factory worker. Behind every battle was a supply line. Behind every victory was someone like me, making sure the boys had what they needed. I'm glad we're remembering now." She's right. The story of World War II is often told as a story of battles and generals and heroic actions. And those things mattered. But underneath everything, supporting everything, making everything possible, was American industrial production. The unglamorous work of people who never fired a shot, but who won the war just as surely as any soldier. Let me give you one more set of numbers that captures the totality of this achievement. The total economic cost of World War II for the United States was approximately $4.1 trillion in today's money. In 6 years, America spent more on the war effort than the entire GDP of most nations. That money built 88,000 tanks, 256,000 artillery pieces, 105,000 mortars, 3 million machine guns, 2.4 million military trucks, 2.6 million tons of bombs, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Think about that number. That's enough to fire 130,000 bullets for every single German and Japanese soldier. That's not counting bullets used for training, testing, or ones that were lost or wasted, just the bullets that were shipped overseas and distributed to combat units. The Axis powers never had a chance once that American industrial machine reached full production. But perhaps the most telling comparison is this. In 1945, the United States was producing 40% of the world's total economic output. 40%. One nation producing nearly half of everything made on Earth. That concentration of productive capacity never existed before and hasn't existed since. For a brief moment in history, America was the factory for the entire planet. The Soviet Union depended on American production. Britain depended on American production. China depended on American production. Even after the war, when Europe was rebuilding, they depended on American production through the Marshall Plan. That Willow Run factory, that empty field Charles Sorensen had stared at in 1941, became a symbol of something unprecedented in human history. Industrial capacity so vast it could simultaneously fight a two-ocean war, supply multiple allies, and still produce consumer goods for people at home. Because here's something remarkable. Even during total war, Americans at home had more than citizens of other nations. There was rationing, yes. Sugar was limited, gasoline was limited, butter was scarce. But Americans still ate better than anyone, except perhaps the Canadians. American civilians still had access to goods that were luxuries elsewhere. The economy was so productive that even while building the largest military machine in history, there was still enough left over for a reasonably comfortable civilian life. This created a strange dynamic. American soldiers returning from Europe or the Pacific would describe absolute devastation. Cities destroyed, people starving, economies shattered. And they'd come home to a country that looked untouched. Houses intact. Stores full of goods, factories humming. It was disorienting. The war had been fought everywhere except the continental United States, and American industry had made that possible. A veteran named Paul Fussell, who later became a historian, wrote about this disconnect. He described returning to the United States in 1945 after fighting in France and Germany. "I had seen cities reduced to rubble. I had seen people living in cellars and ruins. I had seen hunger and desperation. Then I landed in New York, and it was like stepping into a different world. Buildings intact, people well-fed, stores selling things we hadn't seen in Europe for years. I realized then that America had won not just because we fought well, but because we were never touched. Our factories never stopped. Our cities were never bombed. Our fields kept producing food. Geography and two oceans had protected us, and we had used that protection to build an unstoppable war machine. Geography mattered. But it wasn't just geography. Canada had the same geographic protection. Mexico had similar advantages. They didn't become the arsenal of democracy. America did, because of specific choices, specific innovations, specific systems that already existed before the war and were adapted for wartime production. The assembly line, invented by Henry Ford and refined by people like Charles Sorensen, made mass production possible. American education, which emphasized practical skills and widespread literacy, created a workforce that could quickly learn complex tasks. American infrastructure, the roads and railways and electric grid built during the Depression through programs like the New Deal, provided the framework for moving materials and people. American culture, which valued innovation and rewarded success, encouraged the kind of problem-solving that won wars. None of this was inevitable. It was the result of choices made over decades. Choices to invest in education, choices to build infrastructure, choices to develop industrial capacity. When the crisis came, America had the tools to respond. Other nations with similar geography, similar resources, similar populations didn't have those tools.
Let me tell you about one final person. His name was Donald Nelson. He was chairman of the War Production Board from 1942 to 1944. His job was coordinating American industry for war production. Before the war, he worked at Sears, Roebuck and Company. He understood supply chains, logistics, and mass marketing. Roosevelt picked him precisely because he wasn't a military man. He was a businessman who understood how to organize complex systems. In 1946, after the war, Nelson gave a speech at Harvard University. In it, he reflected on what America had accomplished. He said, "People talk about American ingenuity, American determination, American bravery. All of those things are real and important, but what won the war was something more fundamental. We had built over decades an economy that could produce almost anything in almost any quantity. That economy existed before Pearl Harbor. The war didn't create it. The war revealed it and directed it toward a single purpose. What we learned is that free enterprise, properly organized and motivated, can accomplish things that command economies cannot. Not because command economies are stupid, but because free economies are flexible. When we needed more bombers, dozens of companies figured out how to build them. When we needed more ships, shipyards competed to build them faster. When we needed new technology, universities and corporations and independent inventors all contributed. That diversity, that chaos, that competition, it looked inefficient, but it was actually the source of our strength." He was describing something profound. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just factories and workers. It was a system, an ecosystem of innovation and production that could adapt to any challenge. The Germans built excellent weapons, but they built them slowly and couldn't adapt quickly when designs needed to change. The Japanese built powerful naval vessels, but they couldn't replace them when they were sunk. America built good enough weapons in overwhelming quantities and continuously improved them based on battlefield feedback. The Sherman tank is a perfect example. Early Shermans in 1942 had significant flaws. The armor was too thin, the gun was too weak, the ammunition storage made them prone to catching fire. German tank crews called them Tommy cookers because they burned so easily. But instead of starting from scratch with a completely new design, which would have taken years, American engineers made incremental improvements. They added thicker armor. They developed a better gun. They changed the ammunition storage. By 1944, the Sherman was a much better tank than it had been in 1942. Not perfect, but better. And they kept producing them in massive numbers while making those improvements. Compare that to the German approach. The Panther tank was excellent when it was introduced, but it had mechanical problems. Instead of fixing those problems in the existing design, the Germans started working on even heavier, more complex tanks like the King Tiger. These new designs took longer to produce, required more resources, and were even less reliable. The Germans were chasing perfection, while the Americans were producing adequacy in overwhelming numbers. There's a lesson there that extends beyond warfare. Perfection is the enemy of good enough. America won not by being perfect, but by being good enough and fast enough and flexible enough. I want to bring this back to the human scale one last time, because ultimately, the arsenal of democracy was people. Not machines, not factories, not resources. People making choices. Charles Sorensen chose to accept an impossible challenge. Rosina Tucker chose to leave domestic work and become a welder. May Creer chose to move halfway across the country to build bombers. Dorothy Cole chose to work in a factory while her husband fought overseas. Andrew Higgins chose to adapt his swamp boats for military use. John Gorsuch chose to spend 8 months solving a metallurgy problem. Benjamin Davis chose to become a pilot despite facing discrimination. Paul Fussell chose to fight in Europe. John Basilone chose to return to combat when he could have stayed safe. Millions of individual choices made by people who believed their actions mattered. And they were right. Every rivet installed, every weld completed, every tank assembled, every ship launched, it all mattered. The cumulative effect of millions of people doing their jobs, solving problems, working hard, that's what defeated the Axis powers. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just industrial capacity. It was a national will. It was a country deciding that despite the cost, despite the sacrifice, despite the uncertainty, some things were worth fighting for. Freedom was worth fighting for. Democracy was worth fighting for. The right of people to live without tyranny was worth fighting for. And once America made that decision, once the country committed fully to that goal, the outcome was never really in doubt. The Axis powers had skill, they had courage, they had excellent equipment in many cases, but they couldn't match American production. They couldn't match American logistics. They couldn't match American determination. They ran the arithmetic and realized they couldn't win. It just took 4 years for that arithmetic to play out on battlefields around the world. Today, when you see old photographs of factories filled with workers building bombers, when you see documentaries showing endless rows of tanks rolling off assembly lines, when you read about Liberty ships being launched every day, remember that behind every image is a story, a person who chose to contribute, a person who believed their work mattered, a person who helped win the war. They were right to believe that. They won the war. Not with magic, not with luck, but with hard work, innovation, and overwhelming material superiority. The arsenal of democracy wasn't a metaphor. It was real. It was measurable. It was the difference between victory and defeat, between freedom and tyranny, between the world we have today and the dark world that might have been. That's the story of how American industry defeated the Axis powers. Not just because America could produce more, though that was crucial, but because America chose to produce more, organized itself to produce more, and sustained that production until victory was achieved. The numbers tell the story. 296,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2,700 Liberty ships. Behind each number, a person. Behind each person, a choice. Behind each choice, the belief that what they were doing mattered. They were right. It mattered more than perhaps any industrial effort in human history. The arsenal of democracy saved the world. And it was built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things.